how power works, how it affects people's perceptions of each other, and also some of the stuff about how people rise to levels of power within organisations or just socially. So the quote is the John Dalberg-Acton quote: "Power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely," and Dalberg-Acton uttered those famous words in around about the late 1800s. Now, just a couple of things about the webinar today. If anybody wants the notes, then you'll be able to make contact with me to get the notes, and in addition to that, we will be sending around the opportunity for people to view a recording of this webinar so that you'll get a chance to forward this to other people if you'd like to do so. So just to set some objectives for today, firstly we're going to be talking about what is power and what people mean when they think of power. We'll be talking about a thing called Raven's bases of power, which is a question as to, a guy called Raven did research into what causes people to be able to acquire power. We're going to look at some historical rises to power where people have become powerful. And one of the things I think is very curious about the whole question of power is how some people are able to rise to positions of power despite the fact that they seem to have no natural advantage going into the situation. And then that gives rise to the logical question, what is it that causes people to be able to acquire power? I'm going to tell you about the neuroscience of power. I find that when I do my various speaking engagements around the place that people are kind of fascinated by neuroscience, and you really should be fascinated by the neuroscience of power because there are some remarkable findings about power as to how it works and how it affects people's perceptions. And neurologically there are some things going on when people acquire power that are really quite different from the general run-of-the-mill as to how people interact on a day-to-day basis. We're going to talk about research, so we're going to show you some research into power, personality, IQ and values. So these are things that affect whether people acquire power, but they also affect the degree to which people are affected by power. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about what we understand about the psychology of power is that some people's ability to read situations, some people's attitudes to other people change quite markedly when they acquire power. Some people don't seem to change at all when they acquire power. In other words, they seem to be pretty much as they were before power became part of their world situation. So, and then we're going to say, well, what do we suggest about all of this? What should you do? And we'll finish off with a couple of recommendations about the kind of things that you might like to take into account when you are dealing with people in positions of power or when people's positions of power are changing. So the first question is, what is power? And Keltner, Gwenfeld and Anderson in 2003 called it an individual's capacity to modify other states by providing or withholding resources or administering punishments. And the resources can be social, friendship, opportunities, knowledge. They can also be material, things like money, economic opportunity, job termination, physical harm. So they can be psychosocial, which is the friendship and opportunities and knowledge type stuff, or actual material, observable, tangible outcomes. Now, the value of the power is reflected in how dependent the individual is on those resources. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand about power generally is a thing called the principle of least interest. Now, the principle of least interest is as follows. The person with the least interest in a relationship is the person with the greatest power. Just think about that for a moment. The person with the greatest power in a relationship is the person with the least interest. Now, you see this in commercial negotiation. So if I'm in a commercial negotiation with somebody and I'm thinking, well, do I really need this thing that this person wants to sell me? And maybe I'm happy to walk away. Well, clearly I'm in a very strong negotiating position. But the same goes into interpersonal relationships. Where somebody is depending very heavily on somebody else, that person has less power than somebody who is really not depending on the other person. Now, you see this sadly in interpersonal breakups all the time. The principle of least interest, the person who wants to walk away. In fact, isn't there a movie called, I think he's just not that into you? I mean, ultimately what we're saying is the principle of least interest says that the person with the least interest will have the greatest power. You see this in all kinds of interactions, socially and at work. Now I'm going to tell you about Raven's research and the 6 bases of power, because he said that power is really vested into 6 potential bases of power. It comes from, number 1 is the ability to give a reward. So I can reward you either in a monetary sense or otherwise. I mean, maybe my reward is that I'm going to introduce you to a group of friends, I'm going to invite you to things, I'm going to be nice to you. They're all rewards. So people who are able to administer rewards can, of course, have power. Now, of course, senior executives or leaders generally have reward power, don't they? They can give you more interesting work, they can promote you, they can give you a bonus in certain circumstances. There's a range of things that leaders can do to provide people with rewards. Then there's coercion power. Coercion power is punishment or intimidation. Do the job as I say or you will be fired is the most extreme version of that. But of course there are minor versions of that. So coercion might be, well, if you don't do this work the way that I like, maybe I'm going to say nasty things to you or say things that you find unpleasant, or maybe I'm going to make it known that your performance isn't that strong. That's all coercion power. Maybe I'm going to block your access to work that you'd like to do or to social contact or whatever. That's coercion power. Then there's legitimate or position power. And legitimate or position power tends to attach to a particular position. In other words, I have a status of authority. I am the boss. I am the minister of the church. I am the minister of the crown. I am your mum. Whatever. I mean, those are legitimate or position power. And I guess as we get up to number 3 of Raven's 6 bases of power, you start to see that a number of these occur in the one person, don't they? Person can have reward power, person can have coercion power, person can have legitimate or position power, and in organisations we often see people who have all 3. In addition to that, there's a thing called expert power, being an expert in the field. You must know that I know the best way to handle this situation. And in fact, not long ago I read the history of Alan Turing, the guy who basically came up with the research that it caused him to be able to invent the computer. And Turing was a code breaker during the Second World War in England at a place called Bletchley Park. Now, Turing was really no sort of an official of any sort in the army, but he found a way to crack the main code of the German army and the German Navy, a thing called the Enigma code. And but he ended up with enormous amount of expert power because everybody realised that his ability to crack this code made him a very important person. And one of the things that was a really interesting part of that book is that there was a time when he wasn't getting the resources that he needed. So he wrote directly to the Prime Minister, a fellow by the name of Winston Churchill, and Churchill came back to him because he had this expert power. And the expert power meant that he was able to get all of the things that he needed. Now, of course, in organisations, I am an accountant and I understand everything to do with finance, or I'm a specialist in some technical area. It could be health, it could be finance, it could be legal, it could be whatever. My expert power gives me, my expert status can give me power. There's a thing called referent power. Now, referent power is really an interesting one because it's to do with admiration or desire to be similar to. I would love to be like this person. The power holder can use similarity of background and identification as a means of enforcing their power. I think one of the things that's really interesting, and probably if we look at an example of referent power, the one that comes immediately to mind is Nelson Mandela. Because Nelson Mandela spent a fair slice of his life as a prisoner in a place called Robben Island, but he had enormous referent power, particularly with the black community, partially because of the way he carried himself with great dignity. He seemed and was very intelligent. He seemed to be incredibly principled. So he had enormous referent power with the black community. One of the things that was really interesting is how he used his time in Robben Island in jail, because what he did is he made sure that he became fluent in Afrikaans, and he spoke to and became very expert in the hopes, fears, aspirations of his white jailers. And so when he emerged from jail, one of the reasons he was able to help South Africa go from apartheid, this very divisive kind of process of black versus white, he was able to bring both sides together because he developed referent power with the whites as well as the black. And there's the famous case of the World Cup in rugby where he put the Springbok jersey on, and he then caused the whites to refer to him or to feel that they admired him, and so they were able to get through all of that reintegration process without the kind of bloodshed that you might have expected. And so that's an example of where referent power was used enormously for good. Sadly, of course, you then have the case of Adolf Hitler, where there was a referent power that was used for evil, but and I guess like all of these power sources, any of them can be used for good or ill. Informational power. Now, we all talk about the fact that information is power. Information absolutely is power. You can think of people in organisations. There are some people I've seen myself on a number of occasions who become quite powerful by virtue of the fact that they're somehow close to the action, maybe close to the chief executive. They always seem to know what's going on. Have you ever noticed that those sorts of people seem to assume power, and maybe people start to try to get close to them in order to be able to access that informational power? Now, as I mentioned earlier, of course, a whole bunch of these power sources can be in the one individual, and so it doesn't mean that you're going to have just one of them. And of course, senior executives might well have any or all of these themselves. So power tends to have these 6 bases. I thought I'd mention a couple of rises to power, and I guess Adolf Hitler is one of the more fascinating ones, I think, because Hitler came from a position of absolutely no advantage. He ended up being Chancellor of Germany and leading Germany into, sadly, an absolute catastrophe for the entire world. But he really rose to this position from very, very humble roots. I mean, he came from a relatively modest family. He wasn't really German. He was Austrian, which may not sound like much. I mean, they're both German-speaking, but in fact, if you speak to Germans about Austrians, they say they've got a funny accent, and at that stage, they were actually separate countries. But he was an exceptional public speaker, and one of the strange things about Hitler is that he actually left, disappeared for a while, vowing to become an exceptional public speaker. When he re-entered the public scene, he had become so. He was also willing to use violence to advance his objectives, and he, of course, ended up being Chancellor, which gave him the sort of formal authority power. But he was enormously admired in his early days for being a very principled person who stood for Germany. It may interest you to know, I mean, maybe you do know this, but about 10 years, 12 years before he was Chancellor, he was actually wandering around in Vienna in rags. He was so poverty-stricken that he had to live at a men's shelter just to keep body and soul together, and he was painting sort of landscapes of Vienna, particularly the buildings, because he didn't seem to be able to paint people, which may give a hint about some of his internal characteristics. But yeah, he was a guy who had a phenomenal rise to power. Diocletian, I mean, we're going back into a couple of thousand years now, but Diocletian, one of the reasons that I find him fascinating is because he was a Roman emperor. He was, in fact, a very reforming Roman emperor, came from total obscurity, didn't come from Italy, came from, in effect, Eastern Europe, and he was the first emperor in entire history. I think there was only 2 of them ever who voluntarily abdicated his title. And Diocletian was famous for being quite a humble and balanced and reasonable guy. Now, anybody who's read any history of ancient Rome knows that plenty of people were not like that. They were kind of nuts when they got to their position of power, and it was Dalberg-Acton where he wrote that thing about power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely. That's often been used as a quote to describe the Roman Empire. Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power from nothing. I mean, he wasn't French, he was Corsican, yet he ended up the French emperor. Remarkable. L. Ron Hubbard, a failed writer of science fiction, becomes Scientology is a very big organisation now, came from nothing. And if you ever see the movie Going Clear, it's a fascinating description of how a person can become a leader of an enormous cult, purely and simply initially by developing referent power. And one of the things that was really interesting about that movie is that the interviewers interviewed some of his inner followers who were intelligent, well-presented, seemingly extremely reasonable people. Yet he was able to get them to do all kinds of amazingly self-denying and self-sacrificing things by virtue of the fact that they simply came to admire him so much. Remarkable. So that causes the question of what causes them to rise to power from nowhere. We know that, for instance, physical characteristics can have something to do with this. It seems that people who are tended to be given power in general tend to have high levels of personal vitality. Not all the time, but they certainly seem to be active, vital, energetic people, or at least perceived to be that way. In addition to that, there is a correlation between height and power. That's not to say that everybody who's powerful is tall or everybody who's tall is powerful, but there is a correlation. It's not a massive correlation, but in general, powerful people tend to be a little taller than others. But certainly one of the things that's been found in a range of research is that people who are fit, healthy, energetic looking tend to be in positions of power more often than those who are not. Status, of course. I mean, I got elected or I'm your boss or whatever, that causes people to achieve power. Others' dependence on the resources and rewards that the person controls. Well, you know, we're back to Raven's 6 bases of power. Perception of success. If somebody is perceived to be successful, I don't know if you remember a guy by the name of Clive Palmer. Now, he was perceived to be very rich and perceived to be independently wealthy and perceived to have come from nowhere. And that's one of the things I think gave him his power. That perception of success seemed to be something that was very effective in causing him to get power. Another thing that we know is cognitive ability. So a person's intelligence tends to cause them to be more powerful. In short, just to cut through all of the research, most people strongly prefer to be led by somebody that they perceive as being smarter than they are. Okay? So it is rare for me to want to follow somebody who I consider to be less intelligent than me. People tend to follow people who they consider to be smarter than they are, which might be a little scary in the case of Donald Trump, but maybe I'm editorializing slightly there. Personality. Now, we know that there are personality characteristics that cause people to be seen as being appropriate places to put your trust or to confer power. And we know that people who are conceived to be energetic, which is the personality characteristic of personality, energetic people, people who are very active, tend to be given power far more often than people who are, let's say, very lax in the way that they view their responsibilities or tend not to try hard. People who have big extroverts tend to get power more often than introverts, and that's been a characteristic that's been observed in many occasions, that people with big personalities tend to be given power and to assume power more often than those who aren't like that. Values. We tend to confer power on people that seem to have similar values to us. So that goes back to the question of referent power. One of the things that gives people referent power is that, let's say I'm very religiously devout. I'm not, but let's say I was. I'm far more likely to be followed by people who are similarly religiously devout than by atheists, let's say. And if I'm an avowed atheist, well, the referent power idea would suggest that I'm more likely to be followed by other atheists. So let's talk about the neuroscience of power, and this is kind of interesting because what it really shows you is that power affects people's perceptions very markedly. Now you see the first study here, this is a perspectives taking study, Galinsky et al. In 2006. Now, the task here is that people were asked to draw an E on their forehead. Just imagine this, you're in a study and you get a pen, presumably not a permanent pen, but a water-soluble pen, and you're going to draw an E on your forehead. Now, those primed with higher power tend to draw the E from their own perspective. Those with low power tend to draw it from the other person's perspective. So how do I draw the E? The researchers didn't say, look, draw it this way. They just said, draw an E on your forehead. If I consider myself to be a powerful person, I draw the E from my own perspective, what I think it would look like to me. If I perceive myself to be less powerful, I draw it from the other person's perspective. Now you see the word primed there. There are ways that you can prime people to be in a certain mindset. And priming is of itself quite an interesting highway and byway of psychology. The idea of priming, the first priming study that was ever done that really rose to fame was from a guy called Solomon Asch. And Solomon Asch did a study where he got people to undertake word puzzles, but he split the groups in half. And half of the people who undertook these word puzzles dealt with words, well, they thought they were doing a study where, okay, I'm solving word problems. This is what this research is about. Like so many pieces of research from history and psychology, that wasn't what it was about at all. It was actually about a thing called priming. So what Ash did is he got half of the people who completed this study to deal with words in their word puzzles that were words associated with youth and vigour and vitality and strength. And the other half, he got them to deal with words in their word puzzles which were to do with feebleness and elderliness and infirmity and weakness. And then the most interesting thing that he did is that he measured the speed of people as they walked away from the experiment. He had a camera set up which was designed to measure the speed of people walking, movement, and he was able to demonstrate that there was quite a strong statistically significant difference between the speed of people walking away. Now this is interesting from a whole bunch of different points of view. One of them is that people are actually often primed in their attitude to candidates when they interview them. And I haven't got time to go into that. There's a separate presentation that I give on that topic. But priming is something that can be done a lot. So in effect, what would have happened in the Galinsky study is that the people were primed with higher power were probably asked to do some sort of a task, but associated with words to do with and sensations of power, authority, domination, that kind of stuff. The low power primed people would have been people who were primed with things like subservient, weak, dominated, those kind of words. But whatever else happens, it caused them to reverse the E on their forehead when they were primed this way. So perspective taking. Another study showed that people who were primed for higher power tended to have much worse social judgment. Social judgment in the sense of, should this person be trusted? Is this person reliable? Is this person somebody who you could take advice from? They tend to rely much more heavily on their own perspectives. In other words, they didn't take advice very well from other people. They tended to think, well, no, I'm right. And the other thing that was shown is that they were unable to consider the other people's perspectives. When people consider themselves to be powerful, they become worse at considering another person's perspective, all of which, as I'm sure you understand, can be a little bit of a problem in leadership roles. This is really interesting. Yap et al. In 2013 discovered that people who were primed to consider themselves powerful tended to underestimate the height of other people in photos and face-to-face. So you can imagine I've gone through an exercise where I'm primed to consider myself to be powerful, and then you're asked a question, how tall is this person? Now, if you're a contemporary person, you might say 160 centimetres or something. If you're an old-fashioned person, you might say 6'2". But however you did it, the people who were primed with power tended to consider people to be shorter than they actually were, whereas people who were primed to be less powerful tended to judge people to be taller than they actually were. Isn't that amazing? And that just shows you the influence of power on people's unconscious functions. You understand, of course, that people had no idea that this was what was going on. I mean, it's not as though they understood that they were doing this. This is just something that happened. Hugavine in 2014 discovered that power tended to decrease interpersonal sensitivity. So what that means is that people who consider themselves to be powerful are less effective in judging whether something might offend somebody else, less effective in judging whether they're coming over well to other people. And certainly 360-degree feedback is an incredibly useful tool in sensing this. When leaders perceive themselves to be very powerful, sometimes they end up with very poor 360-degree feedback, specifically because of this reason. Their interpersonal sensitivity is reduced. Now, when one person observes another in action, the mirror neurons respond empathizing with them. Let me give you a brief description of what the mirror neurons are. I don't know if you've ever seen a really bad public speaker. You know, you're sitting there in your chair and there's this person standing up, maybe on a dais, maybe in front of a lectern, behind a lectern rather, maybe strolling around stage, whatever, and you're thinking, this person is really bad at public speaking. How does that feel? Most people will describe that as a very uncomfortable feeling. It feels really embarrassing. It feels almost like you're empathizing. Not almost, you actually are empathizing with them. One of the reasons that you empathize with other people is because of these things called the mirror neurons. Mirror neurons come in a couple of kind of different categories, but one of the mirror neuron functions is to cause people to empathize and harmonize their emotions with what they think somebody else is experiencing. Not only that, if you hook somebody up to functional magnetic resonance imaging so you can see what's going on in their brain, if you look at what's going on in the brain of person A, a person who is empathising with person A, in other words person B, their brain will show the same brain patterns, the same parts of the brain light up. That's what mirror neurons do. Now, what we find is that when people are high in power, it's as though their mirror neurons become less effective. They tend to empathise much less with other people. So, therefore, high-powered individuals demonstrate decreased sensitivity to the action of others and therefore decreased empathy and compassion. So power makes you less empathic and less compassionate. And so power decreases people's ability to consider how others think, feel and see the world. Another finding is that you get moral hypocrisy sometimes in power. So Lammers in 2010 with some colleagues discovered that high-powered individuals are less tolerant of cheating, but they're more likely to cheat. One does think of all the recent furor over entitlements of politicians. In fact, only about 3 or 4 years ago in the UK, they had to totally revamp the entitlements for politicians there, because it turned out that nearly everybody was rorting in the system, and they had to reform the thing totally. So high-powered individuals, isn't that fascinating? They're less tolerant of cheating, yet they're more likely to cheat themselves. Individuals who feel more powerful are more likely to dehumanise each other, and certainly Hitler did this, attributing animal traits to low-powered individuals or treating them as inferior in some way. And one of the things that Keltner discovered is that when people are highly powerful or perceive themselves to be highly powerful, they actually behave as though they have orbitofrontal cortex damage. Now, let me tell you what the orbitofrontal cortex does. One of the things that the orbitofrontal cortex does is it looks out for risks, but the other thing that it does is that it causes people to be much more thoughtful and sensitive and prudent about what they actually do. So when people have orbitofrontal cortex lobe damage, they'll quite often do stuff which is almost as though they were drunk. You know, they'll just do stuff which is not well thought out. When people consider themselves to be very powerful, they can act like that. And this is a really important point. So the power paradox. Power simplifies our thinking. We tend to see things in terms of self-interest, and it makes us more impulsive. We forget our audience in the service of gratifying our own impulses. And so what that means is that higher powered individuals can actually be quite rude to people, tease people in a humiliating fashion. And I'm sure you might have seen some of this when people have been a colleague and they rise to a position of power. You might get quite different behaviours out of them. As I said earlier though, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that some people do that and other people will actually do it much less as they rise to positions of power. In other words, some people seem to be able to keep their marbles with them when they rise to positions of power. So where does power come from? Can personality predict power? Can personality predict the desire to achieve power, the desire to get power, and actually the degree to which people attain power? So here's some findings. Fisk and Burdall in 2015, individuals differ on their extent to which they seek to dominate others, control resources and outcomes. That's not a surprise really, that people vary in how powerful they want to be. But leaders who do crave power tend to be much less tolerant of conflict in the group beneath them. And I guess maybe what we're talking about here is a kind of a control freakish kind of a perspective on life. The second point's really interesting. They prefer people who ingratiate themselves to them, but actually they don't respect them for doing so. You know, so I need you to fawn on me, but will I respect you more? No. It tends to produce more negative self-views amongst subordinates. So when a leader is a real power freak and wants power, what that does is it tends to cause much more negative perceptions of self in amongst those subordinates. And I suppose that's because, well, hey, I'm being dominated now. I don't respect myself so much. Fascinating stuff. In addition, personality certainly affects how people choose to use their power. So high achievement tends to result in tighter control strategy. So if I'm focused on really trying to achieve things and I'm a power seeker, then I'm much more likely to want to control how things are done. People, you have to do things this way. High authoritarianism, on the other hand, so that's a totally different orientation from achievement. Achievement is about, I want to get things done. Authoritarianism, I want to be the boss. People who are highly authoritarian in their power behaviours tend to be much more coercive, much more likely to punish people if they step out of line, much more wanting to be very minutely controlling. And in interview situations, and this is really interesting for those of you who are associated with recruitment, and interviews, of course, are a power situation, aren't they? I mean, if I'm being interviewed for a job by somebody, then clearly there's a coercive power here. You don't get the job. There's also a reward power. Well, you do get the job. But what they found in this research, Fisk and Burdale and Operario and Fisk in 2015 and 2001, what they found is that people who are naturally dominant, natural power seekers, tend to prefer socially capable candidates. So I like this candidate because he or she seems confident, handled the interview questions well, related well to us, whereas non-dominant people tended to prefer capable candidates. In other words, they tended to look at the competencies of the candidate far more and make decisions about those competencies. Interesting stuff, isn't it, to see how people respond in that power situation, and especially the difference of people who are power seekers versus people who are not that way. Now, we also know that power can relate to a thing called likelihood to sexually harass. LSH, as it's known. LSH has been studied on many occasions. We use the HEXACO model of personality in most of our personality work, and the HEXACO model of personality has been linked with the likelihood to sexually harass on a number of occasions, and in fact it's a pretty good predictor of likelihood to sexually harass. Likelihood to sexually harass is a psychological characteristic, but it does predict how often somebody is apt to engage in sexually harassing behaviours. So, there have been a number of psychological indicators identified for likelihood to sexually harass, but the most easily measured of these is the honesty-humility scale of the HEXACO personality inventory, and the HEXACO is something that we use for general personality assessment. What we say is when somebody's low on honesty, humility, that's a problem, and it's a problem from a range of different points of view, but one of the points of view is the likelihood to sexually harass. People who are low on honesty, humility also tend to bully people more often. They tend to be more likely to steal things. Actually, people who are low on honesty, humility tend to go to jail more often as well. And so if that's not worth measuring, I don't know what is. So LSH and power, likelihood to sexually harass, and power are linked. So when a person is a highly power-seeking individual, they actually, in some individuals, sadly, this can be linked to sexual motivation. So sexual motivation is a dominating kind of a motivation rather than a partnership motivation or an affiliative, love-based motivation. And so men who are high on likelihood to sexually harass are more likely to find a woman attractive if they're primed with thoughts of power, which is kind of scary, isn't it? You will see that clearly in the real world, people don't have to be primed with thoughts of power. All they have to be is promoted. And we're starting to get into some more reasons as to why some people retain their kind of decency as they rise up the ranks of seniority in an organisation, whereas some can lose it. So where does all this come from? The tendency to seek and exercise power, like most things in human life, tend to come from a combination of nature and nurture. Anybody who's ever seen my presentations in the past will know that I often refer to this. And so a person's cognitive ability, their IQ, let's call that 70 to 80% genetically determined. Counterproductive work behaviours often surprises people that I put people in this category, but there is extremely strong evidence that negative behaviours like bullying and harassment and theft have a very strong genetic component to them. And let's say that the estimates of that are around 50%. Personality, let's say that's 60 to 70% genetically determined. How do we know all of this? We know this from twin studies and from genetic studies generally. But nurture. So the tendency to seek and exercise power, well, skills. I may seek to exercise power in an area where I feel I'm highly skilled. Experience, knowledge and qualifications. I might seek to assert my power and dominance in an area where I have demonstrable qualifications or knowledge or authority. And my attitudes, of course, will influence whether I'm likely to seek power, including my value set. And we're going to talk a little bit more about values in just a second. So this is personality. This is the HEXACO model of personality. I was mentioning honesty, humility before. This is the thing that determines whether people are likely to go to jail or not. It's also an indicator of psychopathy. Psychopaths tend to be low on honesty, humility. They also, another signpost of psychopaths is that they tend to be low on this thing here called conscientiousness. Psychopaths tend to have very scrambled and disconnected and poorly organised lives. The third characteristic of a psychopath is that they're likely to be low in sociability, which means I don't really care about people. And anybody who's ever seen Silence of the Lambs will know that one of the things that that Hannibal Lecter character had was a kind of a callousness to people, really didn't care about people that much. So honesty, humility, conscientiousness and low sociability, that is a risk of psychopathy. May not be a psychopath. Incidentally, if you use our psych test, don't worry, you'll get a higher risk rating, so you don't have to try and figure out whether the person is a psychopath or not. Extroversion, yeah, that's whether people are kind of people-ish people and confident and active. Emotionality is all about whether people are emotionally stable or unstable. Agreeableness is all about whether people are approachable or difficult to get along with and angry. Openness to experience is all about whether people like to have new experiences and like to be exposed to a range of different things in their lives. And then we have values, and the reason I'm showing you this is because I'm going to show you a study where we asked the question of whether you could predict whether a person was likely to be a power seeker based on their values and personality. And so what we see is that there are a range of different values here which really determine how a person's likely to act in social settings. Now, the difference between values and personality or IQ is that where IQ and personality are heavily genetically determined, values are heavily learned. People learn their values. And we know this from a range of different research because whilst the number of extroverts in Tokyo and New York is pretty much the same, virtually identical, the way that that extroversion is demonstrated in Tokyo versus New York is poles apart. And if you measure the values of different countries, the values of individuals in different countries, what you'll find is that different countries give rise to different value sets. But you'll notice that there's a value here called power. And so what I wanted to do in this study is that I wanted to see if you could predict a person's likelihood to seek power based on their personality. It's a fascinating question, isn't it? So firstly, if you want to understand whether somebody's a power seeker, it's a really good idea to run them through Schwartz Personal Values Questionnaire because it's directly and specifically measured. And so being a power seeker, if a person is high on this, that means that they're a power seeker. If they're low on that, they're not a power seeker. There are a whole bunch of other values here, 9 of them, that really the bulk of them are to do with whether you're likely to fit into a certain group. That's what values give us. So if I'm in a group where my values match with other people, then I'm likely to fit in. If I'm in a group where I'm different from other people from a values point of view, I'm unlikely to fit in and I'm unlikely to be so liked. So those are values. So in this piece of research, what we did is we looked at the question of whether you could predict power-seeking behaviour based on a person's personality. And so here are the components of the HEXACO model of personality. We've got honesty, humility, we've got emotionality, we've got extroversion, we've got agreeableness, we've got conscientiousness, and we've got openness to experience. And so these are characteristics of the HEXACO. We've also got altruism, which is a kind of a leftover. It doesn't fit within the big 6, but it still is a worthwhile thing to measure. And so can you predict a person's power-seeking behaviour based on their personality? And so we ran several thousand people through this study. And what we ended up discovering is that, yes, you can predict whether a person's likely to be a power seeker based on their personality, and you're able to predict it with 54% accuracy. 54% accuracy, how accurate is that? That's really accurate. In the world of recruitment, reference checks are accurate to the tune of about 7% or 93% wrong. The average interview is accurate to the tune of about 12%. The absolutely best interviews that have ever been constructed have been accurate to the tune of about 25%. So 54% is big. Can you predict whether somebody's likely to be a power seeker based on their personality? Yes, you can. But also I'd be suggesting that you should measure directly using the Schwartz Personal Values Questionnaire to see whether the person is a power seeker. But what sort of personality characteristics cause a person to be a power seeker? This mathematical model, this is a thing called multiple regression, and it allows you to measure to what degree each of these personality characteristics predict and contribute to power-seeking behaviour. Now I just picked out the top 5, and the top 5, you see these beta weights, standardised beta weights. These beta weights are in effect measures of accuracy of prediction. The bigger they are, the stronger the accuracy of prediction. Now what this says, you see, the biggest predictor of power seeking is a thing called greed avoidance. This has got a negative beta weight. Without getting into the mathematics of it, what it means is that people who are low in greed avoidance tend to be power seekers. In other words, greedy people are power seekers. People who are low in altruism, which means that they're hard-hearted people, people who don't care that much about other people, they are power seekers. Low modesty predicts high power seeking. And what that means is that people who are arrogant are far more likely to be power seekers. Is this sounding like an attractive cocktail, incidentally? It's really not the ideal personality for many types of roles. Flexibility, when a person is low in flexibility, that means that they're likely to be a power seeker. Low flexibility means it must be done my way. I will not tolerate other people's ways of doing it. And finally, you see, interesting, isn't it? Because you've got three honesty, humility characteristics here. These are, remember, honesty, humility can predict how likely you are to go to jail. So the third is sincerity. So people who are low in sincerity tend to be high in power. And low sincerity means instead of telling people the truth, you'll tell things to them that you think will get them to do what you want. So that's really interesting. What we're seeing here is that the value of power tends to be heavily influenced by personality. And look at these. These are not positive personality characteristics. And that's why power seekers can be perceived to be greedy and selfish and arrogant and inflexible and dishonest. Why? Because, of course, if you look at all of this, with a prediction of 54%, what it's saying is that a lot of them are like that. Power seeking of itself is not a good thing. Now, just to compare this to other values, we did exactly the same thing to try to predict other values based on personality. And you see, that's where we get the 53.6. But we also asked, can you predict the value of universalism from a person's personality? Now, to explain what universalism is an intrinsic desire or an intrinsic belief that it's a good thing to make the world a better place. So universalistic people tend to be people who are focused on things like social justice or environmental sustainability. They want to improve the world. And so 53.6 versus 42. 42 is not nothing. And what that says is that universalism has a personality component to it, but obviously much less than power. In psychology, once something goes over 50, we would pretty much regard it as being the same thing. Conformity. Conformity is the degree to which I follow rules. Now, conformity is a good thing in most organisations, and in fact, if a person has a high conformity score, it means that they are much less likely to bully or harass or do any bad things. I suspect it's because they obey the rules, but they're also the sort of people who are high in conformity are the sort of people who don't like to offend other people unnecessarily. Self-direction, so we're dropping down to 30% here. Self-direction has a personality component. You know what self-direction is. It's pretty much what it sounds like. Stimulation is all about the degree to which I'm happy to take a risk in order to get new experiences. Hedonism is the degree to which I want to take a the degree to which I want to have pleasant experiences. Achievement is all about ambition, only 1/4 determined by personality. Security tends to have only 18% personality component. Security means I want to be safe and I want everybody around me to be safe. Benevolence means I'm kind and nice to people. And the interesting thing about the low personality component to benevolence, it suggests that I'm the sort of person it actually suggests that benevolence can be taught. And tradition has a very low personality component. It varies enormously from culture to culture. So here we have a Schwartz personal values questionnaire on a power seeker. And you'll see that this value of power is very high here. So the fact that there's a lot of red, very powerful orientation. You also see that this person's high on achievement, which suggests that he or she is very ambitious. We'll call it a she for the sake of argument. She is a very ambitious person, power seeking. Also, interestingly, high on self-direction. You'll notice that power and self-direction are in fact opposite each other. And sometimes people who are high power seekers are actually not that keen on making up their own mind. What they want is authority rather than to exercise free will. That may explain why in history quite often people who rose to positions of power, who might be people who rose to positions of power by the sword, often weren't sure what to do with power once they got it. Maybe they weren't self-directed. You also notice that this person's high in conformity, and in fact the concerns which would arise from the high power are partially reduced, let's say, by virtue of this conformity score. The high conformity score suggests that the person may be able to self-manage and may obey the rules to the point where this is not so much of a big deal. But that combination there suggests a very ambitious person who may be a little ruthless in pursuing that ambition, and given the high self-direction score, this person is going to be very determined to get things her own way. So, how do these things relate? So, personality and values. Personality comes first because it has much more influence on people's behaviour. Values come second because they are important in people's behaviour, but personality being genetic tends to influence in a much more enduring way people's behaviour than values. And values can change somewhat in the course of a person's life. So an individual has high levels of conscientiousness. If they have a high power orientation, they're conscientiously going to try to get into positions of authority. Whereas if they're highly benevolent, they might well focus their conscientiousness on the welfare of those close to them, helping them, trying to make their lives better, trying to skill them up, trying to make them more independent, that kind of thing. Now, if we look at whether values can predict counterproductive work behaviours, so we measured, again, we did this in a course in about some 1,500 people from memory, and so we measured their counterproductive work behaviours. Now, let me tell you what I mean by counterproductive work behaviours. We measured the degree to which they admitted in a research setting to doing bad things. And so what we mean by that is that things like, do I bully people? Do I harass people? Do I threaten people? Do I steal things? Do I take sick days when I'm not really sick? And so we got people to confess to those things in a questionnaire. Now, incidentally, we've got about 12,000 people who've confessed to these things in questionnaires, so we have a very big database of counterproductive work behaviours. We also measured the people's value set, and the question that we wanted to ask is, can we predict a person's counterproductive work behaviours from their values? And the answer is you can, to the tune of about 18%. Now, 18% is not massive, but it's certainly better than your average interview, let's say. Now, if you did this with personality, and we have done this research, it's more like 45%. So personality is a way better predictor of counterproductive work behaviours than values are. But if 18% of your values, of your counterproductive work behaviours are accounted for by values, that does suggest that if you screen on values, you may well be able to reduce your counterproductive work behaviours by a theoretical 18%, which might be worth having. Now, what are the values that had the biggest impact? And the first of these was conformity. In other words, people who are high in conformity were much less likely to bully, harass, steal than people who are low in conformity. You remember I said before that conformity is a good predictor of counterproductive work behaviours. The second most powerful predictor, though, was power. In other words, people who are high in power were much more likely to undertake counterproductive work behaviours than people who are low in power. So what that says is that counterproductive work behaviours, there's a risk from power. So all of this leads us to some conclusions. Conclusion number one, power is powerful in human relationships. We all know that. One of the things that I quite often say when I'm asked to help organisations to restructure, the reason that restructures are difficult is because some people get power and some people lose power. And guess which people hate the restructure most? Pretty clear that the people who lose power are going to be unhappy with the outcome. In general, as a generalisation, power seeking is a bad thing in leaders and colleagues. Of the characteristics that you might seek in a prospective leader, power seeking is one of the least favourable. Power seeking indicates a risk of negative behaviour such as self-interest and domination, and I think that if you're going to promote somebody, one of the things that you should do to avoid the phenomenon of where you turn your best technician into your worst leader, and if they're a power-seeking individual, it may be that you turn your best technician into your most dominating leader. One of the things that you should do is you should check out their value set and you should check out their personality to see how many of these characteristics, such as, for instance, the low honesty, humility. If you're going to promote somebody to a position of power when they have these characteristics, then they're going to be the types of people who might demonstrate negative characteristics when they get into that role. Whereas if a person's got a stable personality, they're not somebody who is a natural power seeker, maybe they don't have these negative personality characteristics, you'll promote them and they will remain stable. They will not be corrupted absolutely by the way that John Dahlberg-Acton suggested. Power seeking tends to increase the likelihood of severe counterproductive work behaviours such as sexual harassment, and I think that this is how I would sum all of this up. Good leaders and good employees generally tend to have what's called an outcome focused. In other words, there are some really important things we're trying to achieve as an individual, as a team, as an organisation. We want to achieve these important things. That's an outcome focus. A power focus is I want to rise up the ranks, I want to dominate, I want to get my authority. Totally different things. And you can assess for these characteristics before you hire, and it's a good idea to do so. But you can also do this before you promote somebody. So if you're thinking of recruiting a leader, it just may well be worthwhile to find out whether that person is a natural power seeker. But as well as that, what are the personality characteristics which drive this person? And are those personality characteristics likely to remain positive in the face of rising levels of authority? As a person grows their power, how are they likely to change? There's a strong degree of predictability in that. Thanks very much for listening today. If you want a copy of this, you will get it, and we will also email around the link so that you'll be able to get the details. You'll be able to get a recording of this presentation, and may your next hire not be a psychopath. Thanks for listening.